Okay, so a really warm welcome to the first panel of this symposium, which is titled Doing the Work. And you might be wondering what the title is about, so let me explain a little bit. Doing the Work, as I'm sure everybody here knows, is a refrain from anti-racist discourse. And it refers to the need to acknowledge, examine, contest, and counteract racism in our personal and professional lives. Thank you. And so now you might be wondering, why is that the title for this panel? Well, as Susan mentioned, in 2021, on behalf of the Institute, I organised a professional development workshop series in partnership with the Contemporary Art Society that sought to provide space for museum professionals to exchange knowledge, share experience, and offer peer support in relation to embedding anti-racism and decolonisation in museum work. And we called that series Doing the Work for obvious reasons. So there were 7 workshops in total, and each one focused on a different area of museum work. And at the end, we produced a publication, which Susan showed us, that contained essays that reflected on the discussions that were had during the workshops. And from these essays, we produced a series of provocations or imperatives for the museums and gallery sector. And I'd just like to summarise those really quickly now to help frame our thinking. So they were to openly acknowledge institutional racism. Sounds basic, but easier said than done sometimes. The next one was to actually create an environment in which acknowledging racism can happen. Then there was to frame anti-racist and decolonial work as critical and to make time for it. At the time, in 2021, that wasn't as easy as it sounds right now. Let's see. Yes, so another one was to forget trying to be balanced or neutral and instead take a position informed by ethics, care, and justice. To do the necessary research for this work, to be clear on how we define the key terms of this work, to diversify staff and also to diversify the stories being told, to redistribute power across the museum but also beyond the museum, and finally to take responsibility, to take action and prioritise care in this work. Now, these provocations and the Doing the Work publication as a whole became a resource for the 2020 project. And so, with 5 years having passed since we staged the workshop series, this panel is about thinking through what it means to be doing this work now. So what is our response to these provocations now? What does doing the work entail in today's context? Has the burden of this work shifted, and if so, how? Indeed, who is now doing the work? And thinking more specifically about the 2020 project, what changes have been catalysed in the institutions that participated in the initiative? So now we're going to hear from 3 fabulous speakers. I think we're going to change the order slightly. First, we're going to hear from Lara, Ratnaraja, who is a freelance cultural consultant specialising in diversity, innovation, leadership, collaboration, and cultural policy implementation. And then we'll hear from Elinor Morgan, who is Associate Curator for Strategic Partnerships and Research at Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, otherwise known as MIMA. And finally, we'll hear from Inbal Livne, who is Senior Creative Lead at Manchester Art Gallery. So without further ado, Lara, do you want to kick things off?
I'm going to kind of repeat some of what Susan said, but I'm not here as an artist or a venue partner, but as somebody who worked on the bid at the very, very beginning in the summer of 2020, a member of the advisory group, and to be honest, whatever Susan asks me to do. So that includes, I was on the selection, I was on the selection panel for Kettle's Yard, and have kind of been involved with some of the process and some of that, what does the recruitment and selection process look like. But I wanted to give my perspective on it because I think it's quite important that you almost have the kind of institutional kind of perspective. And it's been a really interesting process for me as an independent, as a person from a global majority background, and as somebody who works in the cultural sector. We worked on the bid, as Susan said, at the end of July 2021. And Abby from UAL, who we worked with a lot on in terms of the application, for those of you who know Arts Council funding, she pushed the button on Grantium, which is the very much maligned Arts Council portal, and soon to be end of that portal, hopefully, to submit the bid for the programme. It had been a really intense month. We had a very, very short period of time to turn around the bid. And I think Susan, Abby, my colleague Maddie Fowler, who some of you know from the evaluations, I think we must have met like literally every day. We had bid meetings, we were writing the bid, we had partnership calls with all the venue partners, letters of support, which takes a long time to get a letter of support from some people, and the usual process of turning around a bid in a short amount of time. And there are lots of numbers in bids like this. There's a lot of metrics, there's a lot of outputs, it's about money, it's about people, how many artists are going to make the work, who's going to see the work. And the thing about the numbers and the metrics is it obscures the story and the subtleties. And if you've done many bids for a range of funders like I have, you can sometimes almost get bid writing fatigue or be on autopilot. But not so on this project. Driven by Susan, this has always been a really collaborative project from the outset. And what that meant was it wasn't just about bid rhetoric to fit an Arts Council perspective or freelance, but it was about nuance, about what inclusivity looked like from the outset. We interrogated and explored what made this project necessary and vital. There was a lot of endless conversations that were really interesting and looking at centering authenticity and how do you centre artists' voices and the urgent need for institutions to interrogate their collections and practices. So 2020 meant 20 artists and 20 organisations. But also this was developed and the concept developed against the pandemic backdrop, against closed venues and restrictions in a world that was in turmoil. It meant that we had to rethink what residencies looked like, so some were hybrid, so they mixed the virtual with the physical. There was limited site access at times, and this is all kind of quite unprecedented. There was also a digital aspect to the whole programme to widen those access and remove barriers to audiences who may have been unable to physically access art and culture. But this is also about the practice of decolonisation, of artists having agency in what they accessed and how they explored it, questioning, uncovering and responding to colonial and diasporic histories and collections that were also set against a backdrop of global movements and activism for Black Lives Matter, toppling of the Colston statue, demonstrating for curriculum decolonisation, and broader shifts in the understanding of institutional racism, systemic bias, and what that meant to and for collections, and decolonising both the collections themselves, but also the practices that surround them. And 2020 vision also expresses normal visual acuity. It means the clarity or sharpness of vision measured at a distance of 20 feet. So if you have 2020 vision, possibly not, you can clearly see at 20 feet what can normally be seen at that distance. And for me, that's what the artists brought us, as did the curators and the teams at the venues at UAL. A clarity and sharpness of vision, a clarity of viewing objects, and seeing them with a different lens and in a different light. It brought out visual subtleties, new voices and perspectives, and showed a piercing clarity on that which has been hidden and obfuscated through colonialism. This wasn't about extractive relationships between artist and venue, but one of mutuality. That isn't to say there weren't challenges, and I'm sure Inbal and Elinor will talk about those. And the operating context between venues are so different. The cultural context of venues, some have been local authorities, some are private ones, some are operated by universities. They vary wildly in their organisational culture, their operating models, their resourcing and their funding. But that clarity of vision and of purpose means that this moves beyond programming for audience development and diversification tactics into a valuing of the artist's role in retelling the story of his objects and their perspectives on the collection. This is a partnership to retell and reframe cultural identities. And I want to end, as I generally do, anyone that sees me speak, I always end with the words of Stuart Hall, which is about cultural identities come from somewhere, but like everything which is historical, they undergo constant transformation. Far from being eternally fixed in some essentialised past, they are subject to the continuous play of history, culture and power. And I think it's really essential to emphasise that this is about each individual experience, which we'll hear from all the artists later on. This is not a collective one of decolonisation. There are many, many aspects that relate to identity. You don't respond to a monoculture with a monoculture. I was lucky to see two of the artists' work, Gal Jong Kwan's Tao Chi at Compton Verney, where I'm on the board, and Christopher Samuel's Watch Us Lead at Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery. Both gorgeous, gorgeous shows with work that responded to objects in the collections, but more importantly, the stories of and around these objects. the missing histories, the erasure of those stories. But with these artists and the curators, this turned into stories of visibility and representation. And for me, that was what that initial bid on a truly heinous funding portal really meant. Practices of care, of collection, of curation and challenge. 2020 was a story of artists' autonomy and agency. Thank you.
Is that on? Can everyone hear? Great. Fab. Okay. Starting a timer. So, yeah, first of all, thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation. And I'm really looking forward to this brilliant day, celebrating the artists who've been part of this project and hopefully grappling with some of the challenges and difficulties around us as the project draws to a close. My name's Elinor, and I'm a white, middle-aged woman with curly grey-brown hair wearing a sort of big teal dress. And I'm now, as you can see, Associate Curator at MIMA, working on research and partnerships, but for the duration of 2020, I was Artistic Director at MIMA. And this session really is about institutional change, but I do want to briefly introduce Zoe Tamika, the brilliant artist we worked with at MIMA, and then I'll talk about, I suppose, focusing on 2020 as a catalyst for change and one of the layers of institutional work around anti-racism and decolonising that we've been trying to do at MIMA. And then I'll go on to just briefly acknowledge some of the challenges we're all facing and hopefully challenge those of us working in institutions to stay committed to this work. So, there. Briefly to introduce MIMA then, because I'm aware, lots of people haven't been up to Middlesbrough. It's your loss. Do come. It's a purpose-built gallery, really beautiful gallery in the civic centre of Middlesbrough, which is a large town in the Tees Valley. And the organisation opened in 2007, initially as a local authority organisation, and then in 2014 moved to being part of Teesside University. So like many of the partners, we have many facets as an organisation, sometimes conflicting requirements within those facets. So we're a free public museum and gallery with an expansive engagement programme. We're also a centre for learning and research within the university and a catalyst for growth of the cultural sector in the Tees Valley more broadly. And we hold the Tees Valley's collection of modern and contemporary art and many other things besides. To introduce Zoe. So although this session is very much about institutional change, and we've been very clear at MIMA and in the other partner organisations, I think, that the burden of change does not sit with the artists. Artists were at the heart of this programme, so I just want to take a moment to put a spotlight on Zoe's work. I'm looking for Zoe. There you are. Great. So talk to Zoe because their work is really beautiful. So Zoe Tamika, who also goes by the artist name Zoe Tamika and Zoe Guthrie, works in ceramics, moving image, and more recently with sound. And in their own words, they employ narrative building and dismantling, listening and questioning to consider alternative understandings and activate further possibilities as a means towards Black liberation. Their practice responds to the tensions between lived experience and dominant narratives of time, place, and identity. And Zoe worked with us at MIMA particularly closely with my colleague Helen here, who was curator then and is now head of programme, through a 15-month residency period, during which they visited MIMA and the surrounding area a number of times and engaged in a process of listening, so really digging into some of the industrial and social histories of the place. And then they returned to Glasgow, where they're based, to really get into the making process. They developed a new body of work, including a really beautiful film and 3 ceramic sculptures, the trickster, the friend, and the protector. And these are really characters that could challenge, intervene, and interact with the contemporary context of MIMA's collection and the wider histories that it's enmeshed with or connected with. The vessels sat on, I think you can see in this image, the vessels sat on metal bases, which Zoe made in Teesside University's metal workshops as a nod also to Teesside's steel heritage. And Zoe had a number of options about where to show their work within MIMA. We left that very open so that the work could emerge and be sited in the right place in the museum. And in the end, with Helen, they decided to make a presentation in our open access collection store, which you can see here, so that their work was inserted into the heart of the collection and put in dialogue with the history of the ceramics collection in a space that has quite a different tone and feel to the more formal gallery spaces. In Adjoa Armar's words, trickster, friend and protector speak to the risky business of both the creative act of intervention in systems and institutions larger than oneself. These entities are created as much for MIMA in particular as they are for the idea of the museum more broadly. Acknowledging that MIMA, as a younger institution, has a collection that constitutes fewer icky histories for their entities to contend with, Tamika faces the broad history of museums and their associated histories of containment head-on. Within the museum is the possibility of containment of objects that might be thought of as kin with Tamika's trickster, friend, and protector. So what would those already contained require of these entities entering the infrastructure of the museum? And I think this text so eloquently highlights how Zoe's work is intervening into museum histories and frameworks, and how their characters offer disruption, defense, allyship, and compassion or friendship to other artworks already in the collection, but also perhaps to publics visiting and to future artists working with the collection. And we've acquired the Trickster and its metal plate, so I'm really happy that when it finishes being on display here, it'll come back into MIMA and be on open access public display in the space that it was originally sort of set against. So thank you, Zoe. But I want to just try and put 2020 in context within MIMA's broader sort of organisational work and programme. So our engagement with 2020 didn't happen in isolation, and there are many layers to this work. We were also a partner in Decolonising Arts towards a national collection programme at the same time, and maybe we could talk about that a little bit later. And I think it's fair to say there's been a long-standing commitment to anti-racism and increasing equity at MIMA that predates this. But on reflection, I would say that it was through our partnership with Decolonising Arts Institute, initially through the Black Artists and Modernism programme, that our director, Laura Sillers, really gave the team the mandate to formalise this work into institutional policy and practice. So in 2018, before 2020 began, we began a collaboration with Black Artists and Modernism, through which members of the BAM team at that time, so Professor Sonia Boyce, Anjalie, and Ashley Baris, audited the Middlesbrough collection for contributions by artists of African, Asian, and MENA region descent who'd lived or worked in the UK. And their findings joined a national audit of collections that was already underway. Sadly, but unsurprisingly, the figures for the Middlesbrough collection were in line with the other audited collections and were very low. So 2% of the artists in the collection and around 3% of artworks in the collection. 2% of artists and 3% of artworks in the collection were by artists who met their terms at that time. And alongside this research going on, this academic research that Anjalie was leading, the team at MIMA, we worked to do our own audit of the collection, so pulling out artworks that hadn't been seen or had rarely been seen since acquisition, and curating a display and public programme that put those works on show and surfaced the research as it emerged. So we used that data and the research surfaced through the partnership to really set a benchmark and formalise this commitment. And in terms of policy, since 2019, we've set formal targets for the commissioning, display and acquisition of global majority artists. And they're in our business plan and activity plans that we have to report on quarterly to Arts Council, very familiar to lots of people. And they're super detailed documents. So the targets are very, very detailed within that. And we've redrafted our collection policy to reflect this work. So why is this important? Well, it formalises the commitment as an institutional priority, not a personal concern. And that makes the work more sustainable in these times of sort of change and difficulty, so that it might be more likely to survive and continue. It allows us to prioritise learning and development for team members around these organisational aims, around increasing equity. And it cements the need to surface this anti-racist work and the projects that prioritise decolonising and diversifying the collection to the organisation's governance structure and stakeholders through monitoring and reporting at board meetings and funding reports. So this has given me a mandate to raise this conversation at a senior level and keep it on the table. I think sometimes practice, is more visible. You can see MIMA's commitment to global majority artists through the programs and acquisitions and public-facing work we do. But some of the less visible but totally crucial work happens through learning and engagement, and through our work and role in HE, so through teaching and research in that space. And within that space, we do a lot of unpicking of assumptions and racist and colonialist mindsets and frameworks. And having worked with Anjalie and colleagues to practice close reading, a methodology that really centres the artwork over the artist's biography, we've adopted that approach into our interpretation strategies and engagement work. But I think what's less visible is, spaces like this are where a lot of decisions and action actually happen. So the back of house work we've done to improve access to and storage of the collection has really enabled us to research and present a much greater range of collection works, and actually more collection works generally. This work is crucial. I know I don't really need to say that to this room, but I'm going to say it anyway, because we're the people in charge of the content being seen and experienced now in our galleries, but we're also responsible for developing collections for the future. And on that point, I just want to note a couple of things about longer-term change. So out of all of this work, some longer-term changes are starting to emerge. And like many of the institutions in the partnership, MIMA has a significant sphere of influence beyond our own programme. So we've been working to embed and share learnings in projects that can affect this longer-term change. Two examples of this in particular would be anti-racism and creative literacy programme that we're working on with 4 Middlesbrough primary schools, which is supported by Freelands, as 2020 was. And through this, we're working with their teachers, their senior leaders, and with trainee teachers and the people who are teaching the trainee teachers to really get inside anti-racism conversations, and to also, on a more basic level, improve visual literacy and confidence and competence in analysing and talking about art making and art history. So it's a sort of systems change approach that's really crucial. And then in HE, MIMA co-runs an MA apprenticeship, so it's free for the people doing it, in curating. And there are 150 curators and cultural leaders from 55 organisations across England, including places like Tate, National Trust, Wellcome and Science Museum, who are already making changes in their own organisations. So we've done numerous sessions using Anjalie's prompts from doing the work with those active working curators, and many more discussions beside. I think it's, this is all, sounds like everything's great, everything's on track, but let's just take a minute to acknowledge some of the challenges. I think the first very important thing to say is that we're a white workforce. It's interesting hearing about, the conversations 5 years ago. How much has that changed? There were 2 2024 reports that showed that 90% of the cultural and heritage workforce is identified as white. And within the 2020 National Partnership, the majority of museum and gallery workers turning up for the meetings and learning sessions were white presenting. This highlighted the reality of our sector, but I would say the contrast and the power dynamics between the institutional representatives and the artists, freelancers, who were all people of colour, was uncomfortable. So I just want to quote Zoe again. The added dynamic of the institutional representatives being overwhelmingly white and all artists being black or people of colour is both illustrative and impactful. A feedback loop, question mark. The second really key, challenge to point out in relation to the 2020 project, we could be here all day talking about challenges and difficulties, but I think a key one is the kind of stripped out capacity and resources in our sector, and coupling that with the increasing pressures to deliver against, as I say, a range of sort of funders and stakeholders' requirements. And everything suffers because of this. The thinking, research, learning and development, time, space and resource, engagement with other people's programs, engagement with artists, creativity, the ability to be fleet of foot and agile. And in relation to that, there are two particular challenges that I think are really relevant to the 2020 project. And I've noted these within MIMA, but I think they pertain to all of the partners. I'd be surprised if they didn't. The first is around program structure. So MIMA is really well geared up to commission projects for set exhibition outcomes. But the residency model that 2020 proposes is quite a different model to that. And it requires different timescales, different curatorial skills and approaches. And I think one challenge in a buildings-based organisation like MIMA is keeping flex. And really, one of the things we tried to do with and for Zoe was hold space and keep flex so that the work could develop without a set outcome being articulated right at the start of the project. So working responsively with artists. But the machine of the institution is always driving towards these bigger set exhibition outcomes that are public-facing. And then the second real challenge, I would say, is around the pace and tempo of different types of curatorial research and work, and that which is required for collections work in particular. So collections work is slow, it's very methodical. Also, the funding frameworks around it are very slow. It's less visible, and it's often quite unglamorous. It doesn't always have, visible public outcomes, but it's totally essential. And unless we're doing that back of house work, we're not really affecting long-term changes or recording the changes and conversations and discourse that is happening now. So that's all quite gloomy, and I thought I'd just do a bit of a call to action. So we know the barriers. We're not using them as excuses, or we certainly shouldn't be. So what are we going to do? And I think I'd ask us all to consider as we go through the day, particularly those working within institutions, these kind of questions or prompts. What small changes within your grasp? And we talk about this a lot with the MA curating students because it's so overwhelming, this conversation. But it's like, what can you do now? What can you actually do tomorrow? What's within your powers? How can we build anti-racist, decolonising approaches into all layers of our work? Because so often still it is an add-on. What are you already committed to doing in your programmes, and how can you use this to progress your aims around anti-racism and increase equity? And what do you, your colleagues, the artists you're working with, your communities need to continue and progress this work?
Hello, everybody. Where are my slides? Okay. That's like the worst title ever, isn't it? I was like, how many words can I cram into a title? So let's not worry too much about that. Let's just admire Holly's beautiful, amazing work of art instead of my words. Yeah, that definitely deserved a round of applause. Look, she's giving this really embarrassed grin now. I am really delighted to be here and really pleased to be able to follow on from Elinor, because I can now mentally ditch a whole bunch of stuff I was going to say because she's already said it, and focus on some other things instead. So I'm going to talk to you today very much from the perspective of a local authority institution and kind of our particular context of doing this work, which I know will not be familiar to everybody, will be very familiar to some. But I think it was really important what Susan said to start the day about how the context of the different organisations led to kind of these different paths that the various commissions took. So I'd like to start by giving a little bit of background. My slides don't really relate to what I'm saying, they're just really beautiful, so just enjoy. I'd like to start by giving a little bit of background to Manchester City Galleries as an organisation. So we are the Manchester City Council's local authority collection. Uniquely, well, not entirely uniquely, I think there's about 4 in the country. There is an Act of Parliament that means the collection belongs to the people of Manchester, and Manchester City Council are the sole trustee of that collection. So to say that we belong to the people of Manchester, we very much belong to the people of Manchester, and that's really, really important. And I think where we are as an organisation now is embedding ourselves and kind of really seeing ourselves as a service, as part of that greater kind of council way of working. And I think the times that we are in at the moment, being of service to our residents is really, really important. And I should also say that I was not part of the team at the start of this project. So I came in once the commission had already, once everything had been established and Holly was already on board working with the gallery, and my wonderful colleague Natasha then moved on to other things, and I had come into the gallery, and along with other colleagues we sort of stepped in to work with Holly and take this project forward. So we really started this work working with Holly at a moment of really significant institutional change. As an organisation, the gallery had, so Manchester City Galleries is essentially Manchester Art Gallery, Platt Hall, which is another site that we have, and Queen's Park, which is our storage and conservation centre. And there had been a number of leadership models over the years that had very strongly defined ways of working. And for a period of time, the gallery had been co-directed, had a co-director with the Whitworth, so the same person had directed both institutions. And I think it's safe to say, and I think the Whitworth team would agree with me, both had sort of lost their individual identity. So it was also this moment of remembering who we were, who was Manchester's civic collection. And that was a really important moment to be able to do a piece of work like this. And there's Holly in our stores. And I think it's also been a really challenging time for local authority organisations. So obviously, as Anjalie said, this has been a really long process, and the landscape of being an organisation like ours has changed significantly over the period of time that we've been doing this project. Our funding model has changed substantially. So we're very lucky. We are a local authority who has a very deep commitment to culture, but is not necessarily able to back up that intellectual commitment with a financial contribution. And that's okay, actually, because we're in a moment where I don't want to be in competition with children's services or adult services. That's not what this is about. And so actually just having that commitment at this particular moment in time is okay, and we're really grateful for it. But it means that our programming is really, really reliant on external funding. So at the point that we started this process, obviously we had the commission, but quite rightly, Holly had real aspiration for what that could look like. Could it be bigger than? What could the next step be? But we needed to make sure that we were able to fundraise for that, because there wasn't a kind of capacity internally to deliver that without that support. And it was also a moment that we were doing really extensive capital development. So we've had quite a lot of work done to our buildings. A lot of collections were moving around. And so supporting this project, and it's so important that you give the time and resource, as we all know, to support an artist coming in and to really help deliver and underpin that work. And we knew that that was going to be challenging, because so many of our team was just spread, just trying to move collections from A to B and kind of do that very as we've discussed, unsexy background work that kind of makes it all happen, you know, just like that's always going on regardless. So it's this sort of combination of lots of things. And so this was a real opportunity to take a commission and create an exhibition in a moment where we weren't doing what we might term big exhibitions, because our big exhibition space was out of commission because of capital development, and sort of work in that slower, more granular way to get into that mindset where it was about doing the work. The finished product was doing the work, rather than the finished product being an exhibition at the end. And that's, you know, obviously how all of us who work in academic settings have always worked. It's always about process. But when you're responsible for an organisation that has 650,000 visitors a year, you know, my superiors and the people that we work for within the council make it very hard not to focus on that end product. That can be really, really challenging. And we wanted to allow for the joy and beauty of the exhibition and Holly's work, and all the really difficult, complex conversations and work that underpin it to shine through, but also to provide a platform to continue those discussions, to open out those conversations about organisational history, about how the colonial legacies that are just so baked into our collections, our buildings, are still relevant, active, still harmful. There we go. And I think key to the success of the programme, so this programme that we've had to build from scratch, that we've had to fundraise for, in order to make sure that this work had the biggest impact that it possibly could, has been collaboration. And as far as possible, we've been building this programme with Holly's direct input and with a huge amount of support and expertise from Dr. Matt Stallard at the Legacies of Slavery programme at UCL. And a lot of the focus has been on using our presence in the city, our large footfall, our reputation organisationally, to move forward conversations about how we, not just as an organisation, but as a city, the city of Manchester, how we connect our past and our present, and how we keep developing decolonial practice within our organisations. And, you know, it's already been said multiple times, you know, our organisations, and we are another organisation with a white workforce who, you know, we have such a responsibility to do this work, to move this conversation forward, to make space. And one of the opportunities that this programme has given us, that working with 2020, but specifically Holly's artwork and the research that's come out of it, has been a real catalyst for pushing the city to take on that responsibility. And for me, that's been one of the really big developments and changes and really inspirational aspects that has come out of this. And while the focus of the programme and the associated exhibition has been the decolonising conversation, the anti-racist conversation, actually I included this photograph because one of the things that's been really brilliant about this as well has been the shift in audience that this has brought. So the photograph here, there's lots of young people in this photograph, and actually something really amazing has been the resonance that this whole process has had with younger audiences. I just very briefly am going to segue into just when we opened this, we had an opening event for this exhibition, and we have a colleague who will say of herself, one of our curatorial team, Kate, will say of herself that her technical proficiency is limited. And at the opening, she had many, many young people coming up to her with their phones out, saying, with sort of an image of Holly's artwork, saying, "I've just seen this on Instagram. Is it here? Is it here?" And she just thought that was the best thing ever. And it sort of was funny at the time, but actually it says a lot about how a different artwork can just really, a different process can just really connect. And we all know the difficulties of connecting with younger audiences. And I know that's not specifically the point of today, but I thought it was worth mentioning it. Oh no, I've just tried to move your slide thing along with my computer. Obviously that wasn't going to work. We obviously had, as you've probably gathered from how I've talked about finances a lot, quite a small budget for the exhibition itself and no budget for the programme. But with the support and ingenuity of both Holly and Matt, we were able to create packages of programming that could become discrete, kind of smaller asks. So the sort of first level, very simple, you know, can we have artist talks? Can we have some curator-led tours? And that's sort of like, that's got to be the most basic level of what we can offer in terms of programming. But then we were able to kind of put together bigger pieces of work. So I suspect Holly's going to talk about this, so I don't want to kind of talk about it too much now. But the dress that has been created fits Holly, and she can wear it. And so one of our other aspirations was to create a film and to kind of link back that story of Sarah Parker Remond, who was one of the inspirations behind Holly's work, and that speaking to social justice in the city, that evergreen conversation that Manchester hasn't, you know, in my opinion, taken forward nearly as far as it thinks it should have. So that's like a second package of work. And then we have a third package of work, which is about that long-term vision, which is we're going to have a lecture, an inaugural Sarah Parker Remond lecture that is going to happen in January. But the idea is that this becomes something that the city takes on, and that every year a different venue in the city takes on this lecture, that this lecture is about that continued need for conversations around social justice in Manchester, and it gives space for creative practitioners, academics, global majority women in those positions to have a platform and to be given the support to develop their work and their practice, and that the city takes responsibility for that. Sorry, I've been wittering on and I'm totally running out of time. But obviously there are lots of challenges to that. We've had real challenges in a nice challenge to have. We sort of had to go quite far and wide for funding for all those bits of programming, and we've been victims of our own success and kind of got everything we asked for, and delivering on that with the limited staffing resource that we have has been really challenging, quite honestly. I know that's a really nice problem to have. There will be other times where we look to this model and we get nothing, and that's also going to be really, really challenging. Sorry, I feel like I should skip some stuff because I've run out of time. But in actually doing the work, I also really want to give credit to the gallery team. Because of the organic nature of this project, the way it's developed, no one really knew what they were signing up for. We've had really significant staffing changes, as I've already said. Natasha Howes, who led on getting the commission off the ground, left. And then I really have to give credit to my colleague Rosie, who's in the audience, who's our fashion and dress curator, who stepped in to support Holly through her residency, but also then led on the development and production of the exhibition. And Rosie's attitude to this project, to that open, intentional, ready to make change, ready to rethink our own practices as individuals, to step outside our comfort zone and afford the project the support that it really needed, has been real proof of that cultural shift organisationally. And the same can be said for lots of the staff that have been involved in the project, that willingness to rethink some of our normalised practices of exhibition making. And the last 3 years, there's been this really significant cultural shift across the sector as a whole, and local authority services in particular. So Manchester City Galleries has not been working just on this project. We've obviously been working on lots of other projects as well, but we've been trying to move them all in a similar direction and look at how all these different programs can build on each other and develop collective learning. So I wanted to finish with, I guess, some of the key learnings from this project. So I think a really significant one for me has been the building the confidence in staff to centre discussions about historic legacies of colonialism and contemporary social justice issues in our city. So as that largely white staff, but also, you know, there's a big difference between intellectually knowing you have to sit with your discomfort and having the emotional capacity to do it. And I feel like this and other projects have given us that shift from one to another, and I think that's really important. I think there's real learning from the public interaction with the exhibition, that these are conversations that people want to have and are needed. And so as we build our programming strategy for the next 10 years, you know, this has given us a lot of an evidence base for how we take that forward really practically and physically in our building. And has given us opportunities to show how Manchester City Galleries can support that kind of programming through the city as well, which I think is really significant. And I'm just going to finish, I promise, why I finished on this image, because this image for me exemplifies how we take this work forward. That relationship as a 200-year-old collection with such deep roots in colonial history, it's always about that conversation between past and present, and that is how we will make those connections, and we will keep having those conversations, and we won't let that kind of particular line of inquiry from certain parts of our of the world that lean a different political way that we might, oh, well, you know, the past is done, you know, it has no relevance, let's think about the now. You know, I have no time for that, and I'm not making space for that, and actually having these sorts of exhibitions and activities and programs that kind of really tie the past and present together is absolutely fundamental. That's it.